So thank you. Welcome. Welcome live audience and Zoom audience. Welcome Rebecca Solnit. I'm Rochelle Johnson, the president of the Thoreau Society. And thank you for joining us tonight as we grant Rebecca Solnit the Thoreau Society's highest honor, the Thoreau Society Medal. Following the granting of that award, we will hear some remarks from Rebecca Solnit and then engage in a brief Q&A, which we're delighted to be able to do. As we move along, I encourage our Zoom audience to enter any questions in the Q&A function, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. It's now my great honor to turn over the mic and my chair to Dr. James Finley, who lives and teaches in San Antonio, Texas. He's also my esteemed and generous colleague on the board of directors of the Thoreau Society, and he's going to offer us an introduction to Rebecca Solnit, our honored guest tonight. Thanks, James.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here in person. Thank you for being here online. Thank you, Rochelle. Thank you, Mike Frederick, for making this happen. This is something that I've been looking forward to for a very long time, and it's such an honor to be here. The Thoreau Society Medal is the Society's highest honor, and it recognizes, quote, sustained essential contributions to the legacy and vitality of Thoreauvian studies and ideals through extraordinary scholarship or service. And we honor Rebecca Solnit for her urgent and deeply compelling writings about Thoreau, and for the manifold ways in which her body of work translates Thoreau's legacy and commitments into new and necessary contexts. Solnit was educated in public schools in California from kindergarten through graduate school, and is the author of over 20 books. She has served as a columnist for Harper's, The Guardian, and other venues. Her writings range widely from environmental, technological, and aesthetic history to memoir to meditations on politics and praxis, with particular emphases on environmental justice, gender, native sovereignty, and civil disobedience. The list of awards she has won is extensive, including a Guggenheim and multiple NEH fellowships. And she's currently at work on the Not Too Late Climate Project, which empowers people to channel despair into action through putting their values and hopes into practice. And you can find more about this necessary project at nottoolateclimate.com. Solnit has cited Thoreau as a writer of supreme importance to her, and that debt is apparent across her corpus. We see this especially in essays such as Jailbirds I Have Loved, The Thoreau Problem, and Mysteries of Thoreau Unsolved. In each of these pieces and across her many books, including A Paradise Built in Hell, Wanderlust, and her most recent book on George Orwell, Solnit frees Thoreau from cynical and reductive readings and reconstructs his ideals and commitments in a manner that helps us better understand both Thoreau's world and our own. Thoreau and Solnit share a set of commitments to self-scrutiny and to modeling ways of holding oneself and others accountable, as well as to the inexhaustible potential of art, of nature, and of democracy. Moreover, they write about these commitments in ways that invite us to develop our own commitments with a similarly capacious sense of creativity, hope, and love. For me, and for the others with whom I've spoken about Solnit's influence on our lives and thinking, we read and we teach and we write about Thoreau in the wake of and with the utmost gratitude to Rebecca Solnit for her work. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Ooh, next phase.
Thank you so much, James, for those thoughtful words. Readers, indeed, of Rebecca Solnit's essays and books quickly learn that Thoreau serves as a touchstone. His example, by which I mean his deliberate daily life, his writings and wanderings, his attentiveness to nature's details and to living in the nick of time, his hard-fought social reform efforts, His example provides a sort of true north for Rebecca Solnit's literary compass, or at least that's the way it has seemed to me. Perhaps Rebecca Solnit orients again and again toward Thoreau because, like him, Rebecca Solnit believes that, and I'm quoting now, navigating life and wilderness and meaning are the same art. Rebecca Solnit writes those words in A Field Guide to Getting Lost, where she also says, truth lies not only in incidents, but in hopes and needs. Thank you, Rebecca, for mapping in words the truths of our world. You do so courageously and poetically, even when that topography is bleak and threatening. You do so when the truth that lies in hopes and needs reveals that Earth's needs have become mere human hopes, when the truth that is those needs seems beyond human hope, and when human needs seem beyond the hopes of the earth. You ground us, reminding us of the good we have been, of the good we can be, of the good we can make for humanity and for the planet. Following Thoreau, you remind us to live simply, to get lost so that we might find ourselves, to not kill time because doing so injures eternity. We're extraordinarily honored to grant you the Thoreau Society Medal, which we will send you soon so that you can touch it yourself. And we also have a plaque for you that we will also mail. And thank you so very much. We are looking forward to hearing your words. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, James and Rochelle, Thoreau Society, everyone gathered in Concord. It's such a great honor and such a delight. So great to be somehow connected to Thoreau's legacy, which is all I could hope for as a writer and as a citizen of this turbulent nation and beautiful earth. I cannot claim Thoreau's modesty, his simplicity and coherence of life, his avoidance of fancy clothes, although at least I'm not wearing new ones, and expensive habits, or his skills at raising beans and melons, surveying, building, redesigning pencils, or anything else. But I can at least aspire to be a writer concerned with nature, with freedom, and its complicated relationships with justice, with the excluded and exploited among us, with what lies underneath the stone of convention when you turn it over, and with good sentences. Which is not to claim in any possible respect to be his equal, any more than a bonsai in a pot claims to be a sequoia in the Sierra Nevada, because they are both trees. I would have liked to be there in person, I should say, but between climate change, COVID, and the personal impact of traveling from the West Coast into that time zone, I decided to do this from home and to take comfort from this line I used as the epigraph to my San Francisco atlas. I have traveled widely in Concord. I'm traveling widely in San Francisco this week, but thinking of Concord and so many other places. Thoreau is one of the most important writers for my own work, and not because he offers a direct model of how to write or what to write about, then because he offers permission in the sheer rambling range of what he wrote about within a single piece and in his work as a whole, ranging from careful scientific observation to aphoristic declarations to radical political arguments, because he bore witness to the seasons, to the wrongness of the institution of slavery, to the complexity of our interior life, to what you can do with language if you're a rule breaker by nature. Because he took non-fictional prose as his major focus and stuck to it. Literature is full of writers who considered the novel the pinnacle to aim for and took their own essays less seriously, even though those essays are often better than their other stuff. I love him for not being a poet or a novelist who wrote essays on the side, but being a wholehearted essayist. And because American writing has often sought to narrow itself down, to depoliticize itself, and he headed steadily on foot in the opposite direction, to open it all up. There is no such place as apolitical, because there's also no such place as neutral. For there to be such a place, there would have to be such a position, a point of view that is neutral, and we know now there is no such thing. Even with a non-controversial subject, what you choose to pay attention to, what your equipment is, who and what you believe matters, and who you believe, who you assume you're speaking to. These are all political matters. My cousin has a small organic granola business in British Columbia where climate change, as last year's extreme heat, has impacted the price and availability of Canadian oats and canola oil. The Russian attack on Ukraine has done the same for sunflower seeds, and the fossil fuel industry's price gouging, as gas prices, impacted fuel costs for everything my cousin Jessica does, including shipping her product. Even a bowl of granola in Victoria, British Columbia, is a compilation of geopolitics to which we might add its reemergence as a countercultural alternative to corporate cereal. In this age where we're contemplating the politics of place names, public monuments, the versions of history we tell, and who decides, this is pretty clear. It has not been so clear in the past, but the writers who imagined they were shying away from politics were generally just choosing the conventional and mainstream positions. We have been a society that too often considers it political to not eat meat or not pay taxes or not conform to conventional gender roles, but apolitical to do all these things. Of course, all these positions are political. I want to talk about two writers this afternoon, both of them North Stars in my literary sky. Rochelle, I chose the same metaphor. So, Thoreau and Orwell. Orwell is, in a way, how I've been thinking about Thoreau lately, because while I've written often about Thoreau since my second book, Savage Dreams, explored his walking essay, I didn't address Orwell directly until I came across What Might Be the Roses he planted in 1936. And I should say, because of this honor, I started taking stock of my own work. I'm pretty confident more of my books mention Thoreau than don't, in a lot of different contexts, and including this recent book, Orwell's Roses, about Orwell. So, and when I encountered Orwell's Roses in 2017, it raised wonderful questions for me and the invitation to contemplate what it meant that Orwell planted, tended, loved, wrote about roses, planted them again on his wife's grave in 1946, and again on the farm on the Isle of Jura in the Scottish Hebrides, and asked that roses be planted on his grave. I actually just a couple weeks ago was with the Thoreau Society at that grave in Sutton Courtenay, Oxfordshire, and there is indeed a red rose blooming on it. And it's kind of lovely to be with the Thoreau Society and the Thoreau Society in the same summer. I think the Wolf Society needs to call me up next. I've spent a little time with them, and they're lovely too. That's been kind of my literary trinity. So I was using, when I wrote about Orwell's Roses, I was in some ways using him as a case study to think about the relationships between beauty, pleasure, nature, and the struggle for truth, human rights, and freedom. Pleasure, beauty, the things we do that are not productive in the most quantifiable, industrial, transactional sense, are often dismissed, and so are the people who take them seriously. Orwell, as a white man whose seriousness no one dismisses, was a perfect vehicle for this exploration. Orwell and Thoreau, I might note, have a lot in common. They're also profoundly different. They both died of tuberculosis in their mid-40s. Both spent a lot of their lives living vividly and urgently until they collapsed and had to convalesce and then plunged back in again. Both felt like outsiders to the society around them. Both thought for themselves, unpacked at least some of the assumptions in most people's baggage, and made that business of questioning the status quo central to their life's work. They were both empiricists, interested in directly witnessing the things that interested them, for which Orwell included the prosecution of wars and their aftermath, as well as the natural, literary, and political worlds. Orwell never approached Thoreau's caliber as a scientific observer, as a naturalist, but he had his own remarkable acuity about politics and ideology in his time. He wrote a kind of manifesto of his own called Why I Write in 1946. In it, he declares, in a passage I've often used as a kind of touchstone of my own, anyone who cares to examine my work will see that even when it is downright propaganda, it contains much that a full-time politician would consider irrelevant. I am not able and do not want completely to abandon the worldview that I acquired in childhood. So long as I remain alive and well, I shall continue to feel strongly about prose style, to love the surface of the earth, and to take a pleasure in solid objects and scraps of useless information. It is no use trying to suppress that side of myself. The job is to reconcile my ingrained likes and dislikes with essentially public, non-individual activities that this age forces on all of us, as relevant today as in 1946. And it feels almost as though it could have been written by Thoreau in 1846. And so many of those things are the same. The view acquired in childhood, the love for the surface of the earth. But these essentially public, non-individual activities, I think Orwell meant attention to politics as war, as economics, and the unequal distribution of resources, as hierarchies, as ethics and justice, as lies and propaganda, as authoritarianism with Hitler and Stalin in his time. What he makes clear with this is that there are aspects of the world in which his interest felt inherent and joyful that emerged early in life, others that he was called to by a sense of duty. I think this is true for a lot of us. I would be overjoyed to have absolutely nothing to say about climate change, because there was no climate change, or those in power were doing all the right things about it. But we live in a crisis, and in a crisis, writing tries to step in to document wrongs and point towards rights and possibilities, to who we could be and sometimes how to get there. Or at least I believe that's what it should do. If you've been given the great fortune of a voice and people listening, you have to use it for these most important things. It's not the only thing you can do. Or you can write, idle amusements and donate the profits to climate groups. I'm not prescribing the one true path. But I do think that we're all citizens of the earth and all owe our commitment to each other as fellow human beings, to the earth and the future and all the other species. So Orwell writes, even when it is downright propaganda, it contains much that a full-time politician would consider irrelevant. This is about the fact that he's not just doing journalism, but literature, saying more than a journalist might, straying past what's officially important, to telling details, to evoke, describe, home in on a detail. There's a wonderful passage in his war reporting where he describes a bouquet of lilacs laid on the face or on the breast of a dead Nazi in the ruins of Stuttgart that I really love. It's so Orwellian in that other sense of just who Orwell truly is. And that most editors would cut that out. A lot of journalists would never put it in. But the lilacs tell us something important, that this person, a British and American reader would view as an enemy, was also somebody's beloved, that in a city in ruins at the end of a war, the lilacs are still blooming, that in the historic time of the end of the Second World War, the cyclical time of spring is still happening. So these telling details are so much of his work, of his close observation, of his refusal to let generalities and abstractions be enough, and to use often the telling detail, the specific, to puncture it, and to avoid being swept up in the ideologies of his time. Also striking in that passage I read is to love the surface of the earth. Orwell was a passionate lover of the natural world, of the countryside, of plants and flowers, and observing the weather. Somehow this was wiped out in the versions of him that I was familiar with when I met his roses that amazing November day in 2017. Part of what's noteworthy about the roses is that he planted them in between the two crucial political experiences that matured him as a writer and a social conscience. This mix of the pleasurable and political has its ancestors. Let me start again. In July of 1846, as you all know well, Henry David Thoreau came to town and got arrested by the town jailer for non-payment of taxes and spent that famous night in jail. The next morning, he led a huckleberrying party. 90 years later, in 1936, Orwell went to the industrial north of England to report on the condition of the unemployed and the coal miners in that bleak region. He saw poverty, despair, and the foul, poisonous ugliness of the mines and the blackened, deadened coal mining districts. He didn't yet recognize climate change, but he recognized what a destructive force this fossil fuel was and wrote powerfully about it, including how easy it was to ignore that this was the source of all the engine powering Britain's machines and its might internationally. He came straight back from there to rent a cottage in the southern English countryside and commenced to dig up the boots and other rubbish and plant a garden. It was from that cottage and the garden with its rows of vegetables, its roses and fruit trees, its flowers, chickens, and goats, that he left again at the end of 1936 to fight fascism in the Spanish Civil War. Thoreau, when I was growing up, seemed like two different people who were only perhaps casually acquainted or perhaps not connected at all. There was the naturalist with the lyrical descriptions whose work was connected in small books of aphorisms with pictures of maple leaves and the like. And then there was the author of Civil Disobedience, who was important to the civil rights movement and other nonviolent civil resistance movements. The two Thoreaus hardly seemed to know each other or have anything to say to each other in these versions. You can trace a remarkable lineage from Thoreau to Tolstoy and Gandhi to Martin Luther King and modern grassroots campaigns for human rights and the environment around the world. Or you can broaden the circle a little to see that it was the conquered female anti-slavery society that drew Emerson and Thoreau into their passion for racial justice, and that this abolitionist movement gave rise to the women's suffrage movement in the U.S., which was another inspiration in the US and UK. And the UK one was another inspiration for Gandhi when he saw firsthand British suffragettes in London committing civil disobedience and going to jail. He went right back to South Africa and strengthened the kind of resistance he was willing to do. I always like the broader picture, and I'm hugely grateful to the work of Sandra Petrolianis for her scholarship on the women in Thoreau's family and their abolitionist activities. One of the things I utterly love that gets left out when people have that bullshit notion that Thoreau was trying to be a hermit is that this conquered female anti-slavery society had a meeting in the house at Walden. How social can you get? Not only having a meeting in your house, but having a meeting concerned with the state of the nation and the rights of millions of people in it. So, of course, there were not two Thoreaus, but people tended to think about one or the other side of him and package him as one or the other. With Orwell, they made the job simpler by almost entirely overlooking Orwell's passion for gardening, plants, the rural and natural world, observing the weather, wandering around the landscape, looking at birds, raising tadpoles, tending goats, and so forth. In doing so, they also left out that in addition to fascism and lies, he wrote about what he loved, enjoyed, and amused himself with, about children's books, nursery rhymes, fairy tales, junk shops, English food, the ideal pub, the reappearance of toads in springtime, naughty postcards, and what he called good bad books. So they're not two Orwells in the public imagination, just one with everything left out. And one of the ways they're connected that I found absolutely wonderful when I researched Orwell's Roses, in 1946 he writes a ton of essays about everyday pleasures, with very much with an eye to a kind of socialist democratic spirit, pleasures that are available to everyone, cheap and free pleasures. And one of the things he writes about is visiting junk shops, and in them he describes glass paperweights with a bit of coral in them. And I can see one of those austere leftists saying that he's frivolous, he's distracted, he's not doing the important work in life, this is irrelevant. But those paperweights he found while meandering through junk shops became a powerful symbol in 1984, probably the greatest novel written against totalitarianism and the propaganda and lies and the destruction of consciousness it visits upon its victims. So shopping in junk shops is sometimes anti-fascist. Never forget. Orwell, if we look at him, truly reminds us of that. We lose two things with these erasures. One is models of how to be a deeply engaged human being who also enjoys herself, or as a lot of young Black women might say, practices self-care. And the other is the connection between the natural and the political, the personal and the public, the immediate experience and the life of the imagination, and the role of pleasure and beauty in our political and imaginative lives, or the many connections. Rereading Thoreau for this talk, I got so much joy again and encouragement from his insistence on bringing his whole self to everything, the critic, the mystic, the scientist, the humorist, the polemicist, to not letting himself be partitioned. He objected in his essay on walking to the partitioning of the American earth, and so much more might he have objected to the partitioning of the imagination. I wrote about all this some years back in the introduction to my anthology of essays about the natural and political world, Storming the Gates of Paradise. Says the introduction to my paperback edition of Walden and Civil Disobedience. They do get packaged together, but otherwise treated as though they're separate creations. So the introduction, this old introduction, said that conventional thing. It declared, as much as Thoreau wanted to disentangle himself from other people's problems so he could get on with his own life, he sometimes found that the issue of black slavery spoiled his country walks. His social conscience impinged on his consciousness, even though he believed his duty was not to eradicate social evils, but to live his life independently. I'm sure a lot of scholars of Thoreau are just like squirming in their seats right now and wanting to throw things, which was my basic reaction when I read this. To believe this is to believe that the woods were far from Concord jail, not merely by foot, but by thought. To believe that conscience is an imposition on consciousness is to regard engagement as a hijacker rather than a rudder, interference with one's true purpose rather than at least a huge part of that purpose. Thoreau did not believe so or wish that it were so, and he contradicted this isolationist statement explicitly in Civil Disobedience, completed, unlike Walden, during those years in the woods. But many who have charge of his reputation do. They permit no conversation, let alone any unity, between the rebel, the intransigent muse, to later rebels, and that other Thoreau who wrote about autumnal tints, ice, light, color, grasses, woodchucks, and other natural histories, essays easily and often defanged and diced up into inspiring extracts. But for Thoreau, any subject was a good enough starting point to travel any distance, toward any destination. There were no huckleberries in his passionate defense of the violent abolitionist John Brown, but there were arguments about freedom and an essay about huckleberries, written about the same time. In his essay Slavery in Massachusetts, which I took a look at again after glancing or pawing again through that wonderful recent biography of Thoreau, whose author I forget, but she's amazing. So, in his essay Slavery in Massachusetts, he repudiates this segregation, this apartheid of the imagination, ferociously, saying his own cannot be so compartmentalized. He writes, I walk toward one of our ponds, but what signifies the beauty of nature when men are base? We walk to lakes to see our serenity reflected in them. When we are not serene, we go not to them. Who can be serene in a country where both the rulers and the ruled are without principle? The remembrance of my country spoils my walk, which might be what that guy meant when he said that the issue of black slavery spoiled his country walks. But I still think that's a terrible thing to say. Thoreau continues, my thoughts are murder to the state and involuntarily go plotting against her. And I love the bloodthirstiness of that. Love too that Thoreau makes it clear that Native people, Black people had been in Walden before him, that he understood who had inhabited before him, memorialized those 3 Black citizens he remembered living there, and describes encountering runaway slaves and guiding them in that era. The woods were not a place apart at all. They were deeply woven into the fabric of freedom and slavery and transformation and national turmoil. This compartmentalization of Thoreau, though, I wrote in that old introduction, is a small portion of a larger partition in American thought, another fence built in the belief that places in the imagination can also be contained. Those who deny that nature and culture, landscape and politics, the city and the country are inextricably interfused, have undermined that route for all of us. Thoreau's short, direct route so few have been able to find since. This makes politics dreary and landscape trivial, a vacation site. It banishes not merely certain thoughts, chief among them that much of what the environmental movement dubbed wilderness was or is indigenous homeland, a very social and political space indeed then and now. But even the thought that Thoreau in jail must have contemplated the following day's huckleberry party, and Thoreau among the huckleberries must have ruminated on his stay in jail. That alone is a major route to and fro, and perhaps one of the most important. We're usually in several places at once, and ways our conversations and thoughts meander, guide us to the connections between all things, or any two things. If black slavery spoiled his country walks, you can imagine it spoiled or thwarted the slave's country walks even more. Thus the unresisting walk to jail. Eastward I go only by force, but westward I go free, Thoreau wrote elsewhere. But the route to the free West, which for slaves was the free north of Canada, was not always direct. You head for the hills to enjoy the best of what the world is at this moment. You head for confrontation, for resistance, for protests to protect it, to free it, to make it better or protect what's still good in it. Thus it is that the road to paradise often runs through prison. Thus it is that Thoreau went to jail to enjoy a better country. And thus it is that one of his greatest students, Martin Luther King, found himself in jail and eventually in the way of a bullet on what got called the long road to freedom, whose goal he spoke of as the mountaintop. The mountaintop, nature gives us everything, including metaphors. Orwell declared in a 1940 questionnaire for a biographical dictionary of writers, "Outside my work, the thing I care most about is gardening, especially vegetable gardening," a hint approximately the size of a whale as to who he was and what he cared about. He invoked the natural world in his writing in various ways, most obviously as vivid descriptions in most of the novels, including 1984, which is full of lush descriptions of sensual pleasures in between the horrors. In fact, the way that his protagonist, Winston Smith, resists Big Brother's regime consists very seldom of direct rebellion, of attempts to overthrow the regime. And when he finally does engage in that, it turns out to be a trap and a falsity. Mostly his rebellion consists of living deeply and passionately, of cultivating independence of thought and disobedience of spirit, and of pursuing things that mean something to him, including a love affair, a visit to the landscape he calls the Golden Country, and recollection of a nursery rhyme from his childhood. In fact, the very first act Winston engages in is pulling out a beautiful old book whose creamy paper Orwell describes vividly and writing in it with pen and ink. And Orwell evokes the pleasure of the paper, the pleasure of writing with ink, this respect for the materials, which makes him use this old form of writing rather than a pencil, the pleasure of putting down one's thoughts, perhaps connecting to posterity, and the incredible danger. As soon as he begins to write, he knows he's a dead man and decides, perhaps like the tubercular Orwell and Thoreau, to live as wholly as he can before he comes to this end. And I thought that was extraordinary. I think because what's new in the book is the horrors, the description, the brilliant description of what it would like to live under absolute totalitarianism, something not so far from China today. That's what people really focused on. But going back to the novel after meeting Orwell's Roses, I noticed that there was this sensuousness in it, this immediacy, these pleasures, this life of the senses. Orwell instructs us on what resistance can consist of throughout the book, often by offering an ideological context for Winston's thoughts and deeds. For example, he writes, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." And of course, we can all think of contemporary things, whether it's climate change, reproductive rights, vaccination, etc., where people have been told to resist the evidence of their eyes and ears, the reality of their lives, and the danger of that obedience. So the party told you to resist the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. Winston demonstrates resistance to that with the thoughts that the obvious, the silly, and the true had got to be defended. Truisms are true. Hold on to that. The solid world exists. Its laws do not change. Stones are hard. Water is wet. Objects unsupported fall towards the Earth's center. Here, first-hand experience and the laws of physics are a counter to a totalitarian regime that aspires to control thought, memory, fact, history, and knowledge. Orwell, in his own life and in his art, constantly goes back to these touchstones of the immediate, to a direct encounter, especially with the natural world and the life of the senses. This in itself does not topple regimes, of course, but I believe it contributes to the construction of a robust self, not so easily swayed and subjugated by an authoritarian regime or even by conventional thought. And you can see Thoreau as well as Orwell doing this and how they live their life in all these excursions into the natural world, in this hands-on experience as gardeners and tenders and makers. Thoreau is a very skillful carpenter, I'm pretty sure. Orwell's actually a very mediocre but wildly enthusiastic one. There's these very touching pictures of him doing carpentry with his adopted son. So becoming an observer and recorder of experience sets you up to rely on your own authority and capacity to perceive, analyze, and remember. More broadly, I think that this is an argument for art that's not propaganda per se. If propaganda tells us what to think and feel and do, good art fortifies our capacity to feel, think, know ourselves in the world, helps build itself more capable of independent thought, of moral clarity, of awareness of self and others, of subtlety and precision, of close observation. Not what to think, but how to think, and maybe why. It was Orwell's 1946 essay, A Good Word for the Vicar of Bray, that had prompted me to go looking for his fruit trees for a friend and find the roses for myself. But I'd always thought that essay was an outlier, a trace of who he might have been in an easier time. It is an essay about planting trees in posterity and popular songs and poems, and a cheerful, even joyful essay. As it turned out, when I read more deeply in Orwell's work, after meeting his roses, it was not an outlier, but about ideas, interests, and values central to his life. Others of his essays and books also take notice of and take joy in the natural and rural world, far more than seems to have been accounted for. As many writers do, he relied on metaphors and images drawn from the rural and natural world. Squid ink and snow are both metaphors in his famous essay, Politics in the English Language, for example. And another metaphor drawn from nature became crucial to 1984. It was the sight of a small boy whipping a huge cart horse that prompted Animal Farm, and his knowledge of farm animals that allowed him to use them as stand-ins for human characters in his brilliant, scathing allegory for how the Russian Revolution went wrong and turned into Stalinism. Well, the two most common arguments in defense of the natural world and our relationship to it are that we need it bodily and spiritually. There's a third I've long considered significant. It is from the natural, rural, and embodied world that we draw our metaphors and analogies that help us think. They play an irreplaceably valuable role in our imaginative and intellectual life. As Thoreau famously remarked of animals, they are all beasts of burden, in a sense, made to carry some portion of our thoughts. So are plants, bodies of water, weather, and landscape. What happens to our imaginations in an age of staring at screens indoors is an experiment we're living through now. In Orwell's time, nature was supposed to be a stable and apolitical realm outside history. Bertolt Brecht famously wrote in a 1939 poem, "Ah, what an age it is when to speak of trees is almost a crime, for it is a kind of silence about injustice." They didn't know what we do, that we're changing nature itself with our activities, notably the burning of fossil fuel and other greenhouse gas emissions that have set us on a path of swift and destructive climate chaos. But nature was political in Orwell's time too, as both contested and exploited resources and as metaphors, ideas, and images. Everyone invoked nature to justify their political program. The Soviet Union rejected Darwinism as bourgeois and promoted the pseudoscience of Trofim Lysenko, which contributed to the chronic agricultural problems and food shortages there, as well as to the silencing, imprisonment, and death of some of the country's best scientists. Lysenko's impact and the larger repression of truth in science was one of the grim inspirations for 1984. But part of the Soviet rejection of Darwinism was a rejection of the capitalist world's own pseudoscience of social Darwinism become eugenics in the service of class hierarchies and white supremacy, often with very real impacts such as forced sterilization in the USA and Canada. Of course, the Nazis took eugenics to their monstrously logical conclusion. They analogized Jews to insects and including lice, and used insecticide in the gas chambers to press home that point, while celebrating a nationalist identity with the iconography of athletic young bodies, mountains, and forests. Speaking of trees, arguments about nature are also about human nature. Who we are, what we need, what matters or should matter to us, and trying to define who we are. We define what matters, what we care about, what we need and desire, if we regard desire and pleasure as legitimate and valuable parts of our nature, which many in the left have not. Orwell going back to the garden between strenuous work in the public world, Thoreau going out huckleberrying with friends after getting out of jail, are demonstrating that they fully understand what they are against because they know what they're for. Thank you.
Rebecca, you can't see it, but you have a very enthusiastic crowd here in Concord, giving you a huge round of applause. Sandri Petrolinas happens to be just across the street, leading 25 college and university teachers and a National Endowment for the Humanities Institute, sponsored by the Thoreau Society, on transcendentalism and social reform. So we will pass along your kind words to her and to Laura Walls about the biography.
Thank you. I'm a huge fan of both of them.
Yeah. We have questions for you, and I'm going to ask on behalf of our Zoom audience who can't hear the questions until I repeat them, that we pose pithy-ish questions tonight. That would be great. And I'm going to start while we're gathering questions. I'm going to start, Rebecca, by asking how you came. I loved your Orwell book, and not only because you created this provocative parallel between Orwell and Thoreau, but also because you show us how you can do a literary biographical, political biographical study of a figure, Orwell, and make so many connections to our current era and even to our moment of climate crisis. I mean, everything from the flowers we buy to the larger implications for climate. And so many of us teach Thoreau or feel so deeply in our hearts the relevance of Thoreau to our world, but it's hard to articulate to young people how he actually does relate. Is that something that you could talk about for a few minutes? How would you make the case that Henry David Thoreau, this white guy long dead, is actually really crucial to our world now?
I would argue that he may not be completely in line with 2022 values, which we forgive people who died in the 1860s for. And I'm not a fan of that ahistoricism, but I would say he's a passionate anti-racist. He's a rebel. He faced, the kind of, it wasn't student debt, but a lot of economic, difficulty, and chose, a path against, he was a salmon swimming upstream. So, and that he asked himself the kind of really deep questions all his life that I think a lot of young people ask. What are we here for? How do we avoid the getting and spending we lay waste our lives? How do we not waste our lives? What does solidarity look like? What does generosity look like? And I think it's a pretty exciting life. I think that the time at Walden is often misrepresented. One of the Thoreau things I had so much fun with was trying to torpedo the whole question of who did Thoreau's laundry, which is a totally bullshit question. And the answer to that is partly he never stopped being deeply involved in his family's life, including being a practical laborer in an era where men as well as women had a lot of work to do around the home. And but I think just looking at him as an adventurer, a quester, an asker of deep questions, a resistor, somebody who's willing to go to jail for what he believed, somebody who I think would be with Black Lives Matter and Greta Thunberg and the climate movement if he was alive now, a really good scientist based, from his direct observations, whose work is still relevant, charting the seasons so carefully. We can tell what's changed with climate change by his records of when things bloomed, when birds arrived and their migrations. And also maybe somebody who had difficulties in health and in love, but also profound friendships and enjoyment. And I just think like the descriptions of him participating in the Underground Railroad and things are just pretty riveting.
Wonderful. Thank
That
you.
would be my version. I would actually love to hear what everybody else does. So clearly I need to come and sometime in the next few years and hear about it.
You have a standing invitation.
Okay.
Okay, other questions do we have some from our live audience? Pithy-ish questions. Go ahead, Thor.
You talk about the surface of it, loving the surface of it. Why restrict it to the surface of it?
So could you hear that, Rebecca? I'm guessing not.
No, it's very garbled.
Yes, yes. So the question comes, I will admit, from a geologist. So who's also a Thoreauvian, Robert Thorson. And he's wondering, you refer to the surface of the earth. He's saying, what about the rest of the earth? So it's somewhat of a facetious question because he's a geologist. But I'm imagining that you're concerned about the lithosphere and bedrock and all that. Is that where you're going?
That was me quoting Orwell, and I found it an incredibly curious phrase that Orwell used in that case, and there's no explanation of why. And I think he meant he loved the landscape, the natural world, etc. But he did do this remarkable thing in 1936. He went down into the coal mines in the Manchester area of industrial Britain and was deeply horrified by what he saw, which were tunnels so low you had to crawl or walk stooped, in which men spent, their whole working life. The incredible the heat, and men work stripped down to almost nothing because it was about 100 degrees. The chances of a cave-in, a collapse, poisonous gas explosions, were also part of the terror of it. So I think he had absolutely nothing against the bowels of the earth, but he did see that coal mining was monstrous. And of course, he did not have a position on climate change since it was not an issue outside some very rarefied speculations in the geophysical, and atmospheric sciences. But he did say this remarkable thing, which is that it's very easy to ignore where coal comes from. And, he described being in his place in, this little cottage I mentioned. And, the men come around with a van and shovel the coal into the coal hole that everybody had when you burn coal to cook and heat on. And not, how easy it was to not think about this whole system. And I love that because I think so much of what we do as environmentalists, and of course what geologists and other scientists do, is try to make people aware of these things that in an industrialized, in sort of corporatized international society, it's easy to forget where the things we consume and engage with come from. And so that was the one time, other than the foxholes in the Spanish Civil War and digging the soil of his own garden, that I know he went underneath the surface of the earth. But and he did a lot of gardening, so a lot of that kind of digging. But that's kind of how I would take that on. And then the other thing about that coal is that Orwell was often treated as, he was literally called suicidal by one of the men who wrote about him for moving from London to the Isle of Jura. But that coal was burned to provide almost all heat and energy in Britain in Orwell's time. And it was so incredibly toxic that in 1952, a coal smog killed, at a modest estimate, 7,000 people in London. When Orwell moved to this remote island, he and his son were removing from a London where the air quality, what happens when you take the the carbon that trees and other plants so beautifully buried under the ground for us and throw it back into the sky by burning it. So that's my little Orwell climate change pitch. And yeah, it's his phrase, not mine, the surface of the earth.
Thank
No
you.
slight against geology.
Yeah. There's a question at the back of the room. Yes.
And why?
The question has to do with hope. And the questioner says, you write, Rebecca, very powerfully about hope. Do you really feel hopeful? And if so, why?
Thank you so much for asking that. I think the first thing I always say about hope is it is not optimism. Optimism is so confident it knows what's going to happen, it thinks no participation is required, and it's just the flip side of pessimism, which is also so confident it knows what's going to happen in the opposite direction, that no participation is required. Hope for me is about the fact that the future does not yet exist. We're making it in the present. Sometimes we have a chance to intervene in it for the better. We have a history of popular power that has, in fact, from the abolition of slavery, votes for women on, changed this country and the world a lot. And so I'm cautiously hopeful. I'm not hopeful. I like to think of it as what my friend Roshi Joan Halifax calls wise hope. I think there's a foolish hope that is optimism that everything will be fine. I know climate change is here. I'm hopeful. I believe that we can choose the best case rather than worst case scenarios. I know this is the decade of decision on that. I'm hopeful that the struggle for rights, including abortion and reproductive rights, is not over and that will continue. I also see, and part of the grounds for my hopefulness are how radically the world has changed in my lifetime. And I'm 61. The world I was born into, segregation, not only of Black people in the South, but of women from out of Ivy League universities in almost every avenue of power, discrimination against gay, lesbian, other queer and trans people as both criminal and mentally ill was routine and orthodox and official. And I'm older than Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. I was born into a world in which there was almost no environmental awareness, no language to talk about the environment, and almost no environmental activism. They may have attacked the Clean Air Act, but it's only like Roe versus Wade, about 50 years old. We have most of what the right is trying to do now is roll back the incredible accomplishments of the past 50 years in particular, but well, it depends on how far back they want to go. And they're making strange noises about Dred Scott and Plessy Ferguson, Griswold, which gives married couples the right to birth control and may go after marriage equality as well. But they're trying to undo what we've done, which is, I think, a sign that they're backlash and that we've accomplished a lot. So I am hopeful also because I see kind of the beautiful insurgent spirit of the young. I see a global climate movement I've watched grow from almost nothing, become more intersectional and effective. I know we have a lot of victories, not nearly enough, but a lot. And California had a couple of moments this spring where we achieved almost 100% renewables electricity generation, which would have been almost inconceivable 25 years ago when renewables were ineffectual, utterly inadequate technologies to leave the age of fossil fuel behind. So I'm both terrified and hopeful. Those things can coexist. And I am definitely weighed down by some of the terrible things happening, including those last 3 or 4 Supreme Court decisions and the ones coming up, and the rise of an anti-environmental, anti-humanistic, um, right. But what can you do? Keep fighting. I also take hope from the fact that in Auschwitz, in so many other situations where people's worlds ended, they didn't give up. And, Jews resisting in the Warsaw Ghetto, Native Americans after their sovereignty, their relationship to the land, their culture had been uprooted and devastated. And, we see people resist in the face of far worse things than those of us who are white and middle class in the US, for the most part, face now. And I also take inspiration from them. Hope is for when things are difficult, not when they're easy. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would have planted that question if it was an option.
Thank you. We have a couple of really thoughtful questions online that speak to this issue of hope. So I'm going to merge 2 questions, one from Zana No, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing, and one from Barbara Goschel. And I'm going to ask this, as an artist in these dark times, how do you make the present enough? How do you find in the present enough to feed your work and to feed your soul? And thanks to Zana and Barbara for the questions.
And I'm such a fan of unpredictability, mystery, indirect consequences, the fact that the world is always larger than our capacity to perceive it. There was a beautiful moment last fall when I heard a story, an obituary for a man who had just died, a very old man, somewhere I think maybe in Turkey, who had been a famous, beloved singer who could sing for several hours, hold a note for many seconds. And it was interesting only in his absence to know that I'd lived my whole life since he was very old, coexisting on earth with him. And I started to write about that, and then found another old man had died who had been the one person who had cultivated, just by planting and harvesting and replanting, a unique species of seed corn that's incredibly valuable to the genome. So that there were myriad lives like that we don't know about yet, may never know about. There's stories in the Bible of looking for, is it 7 honest men or something like that? But I just see people, I see terrible people. They make news. I mean, news is mass shootings and rapes and murders and corporate crime and political corruption and the suppression of the right of people of color to vote. But I also see the extraordinary work that, school teachers, medical workers in the front lines, climate activists, other people are doing. And I do see a generosity of spirit that I think is really different than what was present before. I see like, for example, the Save the Redwoods League, which was founded by one of the country's leading eugenicists, a truly horrific human being, who was pretending that somehow white people were native like redwoods, which is bullshit, we're all immigrants, to become anti-immigrant and racist. And the head of the former head, I believe he's been replaced by a woman of color, of the Save the Redwoods League, issued a wholehearted apology and admittance of culpability. And most recently, the Save the Redwoods League bought 5,000 acres of old growth redwood and gave it to one of the North Coast California tribes to manage. And so you see things like that happening that were inconceivable. One of the huge influences on my hopefulness was the shift, the rebellion against Columbus's quincentennial as a celebration, and instead making it a kind of radical consciousness raising. And since then, in the non-Indigenous world, the transformation, the opening up of awareness, respect among us for indigeneity, and the leadership role they've taken in the climate movement, and leading us, people who were told that they were extinct, were the past, were irrelevant, having these incredible cultural revivals, regaining rights, languages, ceremonies, land, and in some sense leading us into a viable future. So I see so many things like that. And okay, that was really long-winded. This is, journalists have their beat. In some sense, hope is my beat, and I have been collecting examples, or they've been coming to me for 30 something years. So
Oh, thank you. Thank you so very, very much. We've been incredibly honored to have you with us here tonight. And we look forward to maybe getting a picture of you with this, this medal. Okay, great. And thank you again so much for being with us. So.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Don't stop. We need you, Rebecca Solnit.
Oh, I won't stop until it's over. I joke a la Charlton Heston, they'll take the keyboard from my cold dead hands.
Thank you. Good night.
You're welcome. Take care of everybody.
You too.
Don't stop yourselves. Bye.